Gaming history is quite frankly bizarre at times, isn't it? Particularly console add-ons. Console add-ons, peripheral devices designed to expand a system's capabilities, have been a staple of gaming history, but while many of these weird contraptions faded into obscurity, a select few left a lasting impact. Take the Famicom Disk System, for example, a bold innovation that gave Japanese gamers access to cheaper, rewritable games, bypassing the need for expensive cartridges. Then there was the PC Engine CD-ROM, an add-on that transformed the compact console into a multimedia powerhouse, enabling it to run full-fledged CD-ROM games alongside standard HUD cards. These weren't just gimmicks, they were genuine game changers, proving that when executed well, add-ons could redefine a console's lifespan and push gaming technology forwards. But in the West, the story of console add-ons was far less glamorous. While Japan saw success with disc-based storage and CD expansions, most of the peripherals marketed outside of Japan are mostly remembered as legendary disasters. The Sega Mega CD, a pricey, clunky attachment, promised a new era of gaming, but mostly delivered a library bloated with forgettable FMV titles. Then there was the Sega 32X, a desperate attempt to extend the life of the Mega Drive that only ended up confusing consumers and frustrating developers. And of course, who could forget the Nintendo 64 disk drive? Well, almost everyone, considering Nintendo scrapped it before it even reached Western shelves. While add-ons certainly had potential in North America and Europe, they were often more cautionary tales than success stories, and we didn't even hear about a lot of them. Today we're diving into yet another overlooked piece of gaming history, one that rarely gets the attention it deserves. While Nintendo is no stranger to quirky hardware, this particular add-on expanded the capabilities of the Super Famicom in a way that was both innovative, completely unique, and downright bizarre. So join me as we look at a device that not only promised cheaper games but allowed for 2 cartridges to run on Nintendo's 16-bit console simultaneously. So with that said, I am Lady Decade. Hit that subscribe button if you like strange gaming history, because this is the weird story of the Sufami Turbo, Nintendo's forgotten 16-bit console add-on. Let's be real, if you're watching this, you probably love physical games. You like having a shelf full of boxes, flipping through manuals, and getting that little dopamine hit when you slot in a cartridge or disc. I get it. I do too. But digital games have their perks as well, especially if you're a PC gamer and want to get the biggest new releases for dirt cheap or experience old favourites in a new way. That's where instant gaming comes in. It's a safe and easy way to get digital games at massive discounts. So instead of stubbornly missing out on amazing indie gems, digital exclusives, and day one deals, you can get them for way less than directly from Steam and start playing them immediately. In addition, each purchase directly supports my content, so I can keep making videos like this while you build your digital backlog at bargain prices. You can save up to 90% on thousands of modern, AAA, retro, and indie games right now. Don't miss out on this chance to build the ultimate PC game collection for next to nothing, and use my links below to grab these deals before they disappear. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's video. If you grew up in North America, Europe, or Australia, the moment someone mentions bizarre console add-ons, your mind probably jumps straight to Sega, and with good reason. Sega practically turned hardware blunders into an art form. From the Mega CD to the 32X, they were infamous for bolting increasingly unnecessary peripherals onto their existing consoles, often with disastrous results. But here's the thing. Sega didn't invent this chaotic approach. If anything, they were just following in the footsteps of NEC, whose PC Engine lineup in Japan was a labyrinth of hardware revisions, expansions, and confusing add-ons. Sega's missteps are well documented, but NEC's approach to gaming hardware was arguably even more convoluted, creating an ecosystem of constant upgrades that turned their console library into a nightmare to navigate. But it wasn't just these two companies playing this game. When it comes to Nintendo, Western gamers don't typically associate the company with add-ons. Sure, the Famicom Disk System was a hit in Japan and the Nintendo 64DD was a thing, but for most of us, Nintendo's strategy has always been about self-contained, standalone consoles. But the Super Nintendo, that's a different story entirely. In fact, if you dig into its history, this platform had more official add-ons than any other Nintendo system, arguably enough to rival the PC Engine and Mega Drive in terms of sheer hardware experimentation. From adapters to broadcast-based gaming services, Nintendo was far more willing to experiment with the Super Famicom than many realise. The most well-known of Nintendo's Super Nintendo add-ons was, without a doubt, the Super Game Boy, a nifty little device that lets players run Game Boy titles on their TV screens. Now you're playing with power. Well, 8-bit monochrome power, but still, it was a game changer for those tired of squinting at the Game Boy's tiny screen. In Japan, things went a step further with the Super Game Boy 2, which added a link cable port allowing players to connect to other Game Boys for multiplayer. Perfect for Pokemon battles before Pokemon Stadium became a thing. Another ambitious Super Famicom add-on was the Satellaview, a device that, if attached to the bottom of the console, lets players download games, magazines, and other media via satellite broadcasts provided by Saint Giga. It was an early taste of digital distribution, way ahead of its time, and something I'd love to cover again in more detail in a future upload. Then there's the Sufami Turbo. But to fully appreciate what it brought to the table, we need to rewind to the 8-bit era, a time when alternative cartridge formats were already being explored. In North America, the NES saw its own attempt at bypassing Nintendo's strict licensing policies with the release of the Aladdin Deck Enhancer in 1992. This peculiar add-on, developed by Codemasters, produced by Comerica, and spearheaded by Richard Darling, was designed to allow NES owners to use a special line of compact cartridges. But Nintendo's hardware experimentation didn't just stop there. The Aladdin Deck Enhancer functioned as a bridge between the NES and a selection of compact, cost-cutting cartridges. Slotting the device into the console alongside a compatible Deck Enhancer game bypassed Nintendo's lockout chip, effectively allowing unlicensed titles to run without interference. You could say that the Aladdin offered a whole new world to NES owners, but much like the magic carpet, the ride didn't last long. By using a single base adapter and smaller, cheaper game cartridges, Codemasters aimed to cut manufacturing costs and break free from Nintendo's monopoly over cartridge production. It was an ambitious idea, but one that ultimately failed to gain traction. However, the concept itself, reducing cartridge production costs, wasn't going away anytime soon. Just a few years later, Bandai would take a similar approach with the Sufami Turbo, but with one critical difference. Nintendo actually approved it. The Sufami Turbo, a Super Famicom add-on designed to make cartridges smaller, games cheaper, and allow for cross-game linking. It was an interesting bit of kit. At launch in 1996, the Sufami Turbo retailed for 3,980 yen, making it a relatively affordable add-on compared to other Super Famicom peripherals of the time. But the real savings came from the cartridges themselves. Compared to traditional Super Famicom games, many of which could retail for 7,000 to 9,000 yen, Sufami Turbo cartridges were significantly cheaper to produce and buy. This made it one of the earliest attempts at a lower-cost distribution model for console games, a strategy that wouldn't become widespread until the CD-ROM era. However, despite its budget-friendly appeal, the Sufami Turbo faced an uphill battle as by 1996, the Super Famicom was already facing competition from the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, making it harder for experimental add-ons like this one to be pushed on the hardware. The motivation behind this? Simple: dodge Nintendo's licensing fees. Like many other system add-ons of its time, the Sufami Turbo plugged directly into the Super Famicom's cartridge slot, acting as a gateway to a small but unique library of games. At first glance, it might seem like nothing more than a simple adapter, but what set it apart was something rarely seen in gaming hardware: a dual cartridge slot design. Instead of just one slot for a game, the Sufami Turbo featured two, allowing players to insert an additional cartridge that could interact with the main game. This wasn't just some gimmick. Certain titles could share data between cartridges, unlock new characters, add additional content, or even expand gameplay features. It was an ambitious attempt to add modular functionality to the Super Famicom without relying on expensive expansions or proprietary hardware, an idea that, in hindsight, was well ahead of its time. Interestingly, the Sufami Turbo didn't handle all the processing. Instead, some of the necessary hardware was built into the cartridges rather than the add-on itself. This cost-cutting measure allowed Bandai to manufacture smaller, cheaper games while keeping the Sufami Turbo itself as a relatively simple adapter. Much like the deck enhancer before it, the Sufami Turbo was designed around one core principle: cutting costs. By using smaller proprietary cartridges instead of full-sized Super Famicom carts, Bandai could bypass Nintendo's expensive cartridge manufacturing process. This meant cheaper games, faster development cycles, and more control over distribution. But that doesn't make it any less of an intriguing contraption. Unlike the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, which was an unlicensed workaround, the Sufami Turbo had Nintendo's full approval. In fact, Bandai and Nintendo had a strong working relationship throughout the 80s and 90s. Bandai wasn't just another third-party developer, they were one of Japan's biggest toy and media giants, publishing some of the most recognizable licensed games for both the Famicom and Super Famicom. Their collaborations weren't just limited to software either. Bandai had even worked on hardware concepts for Nintendo, including the Bandai Het, a Super Famicom laptop that never saw a full release. We covered that bizarre lost relic on this channel last week. But today, it's all about the Sufami Turbo, Bandai's officially sanctioned attempt to change how Super Famicom games were distributed. These Sufami Turbo games all allowed a unique standardized format appearing roughly the same size as a Game Boy cartridge. This compact design wasn't just about saving space, it was about keeping costs low and making game production more efficient. Functionally, the Sufami Turbo was simple: insert a game into slot 1 and you're good to go. But where things got interesting was slot 2. Instead of just sitting there unused, it allowed players to insert a second cartridge that could provide additional data. Depending on the game, this could mean unlocking new content, expanding character rosters, or even modifying gameplay elements. Out of the 13 games released for the system, 9 featured some kind of cross-game compatibility, meaning players who owned multiple titles could experience interactions that weren't available in standalone play. This wasn't just a neat extra, it was a core selling point of the Sufami Turbo, making its small game lineup feel more interconnected than the typical Super Famicom library. But why only 13 games? Unlike other Super Famicom peripherals, which often had multiple publishers developing for them, the Sufami Turbo's entire game library was controlled by Bandai. This meant that instead of attracting a wide variety of developers, the add-on was primarily used to expand existing Bandai franchises, such as SD Gundam, Ultraman, and Super Sentai or Car Ranger. This lack of third-party support heavily limited the system's potential, making it far more niche than it might have been otherwise. This small library size likely played a major role in the Sufami Turbo's lack of long-term success. With only 13 titles, its appeal was limited to Bandai loyalists rather than the broader Super Famicom audience, and while the cross-game compatibility feature was a clever innovation, it ultimately didn't make up for the system's restricted selection of games. Even so, this alone likely played a key role in Nintendo approving the Sufami Turbo. While cutting down cartridge manufacturing costs was clearly a major factor, this system wasn't just a loophole to avoid Nintendo's strict licensing fees, it actually expanded what the Super Famicom could do. If we take a close look at the Sufami Turbo game boxes, you'll notice a simple yet effective visual cue: a yellow diagram on the package. This icon indicated whether a game was linkable with others. If the diagram showed 2 cartridges, that meant the game could interact with another title. If it displayed only one, then what you saw was what you got. It's simple, but makes sense. While Bandai sold the Sufami Turbo as a standalone unit, some versions were bundled with a pack-in game, making it easier for players to jump straight into the action without needing to buy additional cartridges. Of the 13 titles available, nearly half belonged to a single franchise, SD Gundam Generation. This tactical role-playing series took full advantage of the Sufami Turbo's dual slot system, allowing players to link multiple SD Gundam games together. By inserting a second cartridge, players could import characters, stats, or additional content, effectively expanding the experience beyond what a single game offered. It was a unique approach that gave players a real incentive to own multiple titles in the series. And because Bandai was practically printing money with Gundam at the time, this wasn't the only franchise they leveraged for the Sufami Turbo. The add-on also played host to the SD Ultra Battle series, 2 beat-em-ups based on the Ultraman universe, one focusing on Ultraman himself, and the other on Ultra 7. Like SD Gundam, these Ultraman titles also made use of the system's cartridge linking feature, allowing players to swap characters between games. This was cool and all, but when looking at the Sufami Turbo today, what stands out most is just how much it foreshadowed modern DLC and expansion packs. Think about it. Players could buy one core game, then purchase a second cartridge that unlocked additional characters, levels, or content. It's essentially a physical version of modern-day downloadable expansions, except instead of online updates, you'd insert a second cartridge to get new features. The SD Gundam and Ultraman titles in particular functioned in the same way that expansion passes do today, with one game acting as a base experience and the second cartridge enhancing it with new material. The Sufami Turbo may not have invented modular content, but it was certainly a precursor that games would eventually embrace expansion packs and DLC. As for the remaining 4 games, these were entirely standalone, meaning no fancy cartridge swapping. First up, Crayon Shinchan Nagagatsu, based on the Japanese anime that, let's be honest, barely made a dent in the West. Then there's Yokai, a game that looks about as rudimentary as Muck, and Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon S, a Bubble inspired puzzle game slapped with the Sailor Moon license because, well, people love puzzle games. Moving from anime icons to live-action heroes, the Sufami Turbo also played host to a Super Sentai game, one based on the very same series that Mighty Morphin Power Rangers shamelessly chopped up for stock footage. This particular title, which I mentioned briefly earlier, focused on Gekusu Sentai Car Ranger, the Sentai season that would later be repackaged in the West as Power Rangers Turbo, an era of Power Rangers that many fans credit with almost killing the franchise. But what about the Car Ranger game on the Sufami Turbo? Was it just as much of a train wreck as its Power Rangers Turbo counterpart? Well, I don't think so. The Car Ranger game on the Sufami Turbo is a straightforward pick-up-and-play platformer with a mix of beat-em-up and hack-and-slash elements. Stage by stage, players take control of each of the Rangers, battling through various environments and squaring off against bosses from the show. Does it revolutionise the Super Famicom? No. Does it even use the Sufami Turbo's signature cartridge linking feature? Also no. But as far as Power Rangers Turbo adaptations go, it's at least respectable, which is more than we can say for the actual TV show. Wait a minute. Sufami Turbo. Power Rangers Turbo. I think I've just stumbled across a conspiracy! But I'll leave the investigative journalism to someone with a corkboard, red string, and way too much free time. Today, the Sufami Turbo stands out in gaming history as an officially licensed, yet highly obscure experiment, blending cost-saving measures with creative game design in a way few other add-ons attempted. While it never took off, it remains a fascinating relic of the wild, experimental era of 16-bit gaming, and for that reason, we should show it some appreciation. Don't forget, you can save up to 90% on thousands of modern, AAA, retro and indie games right now. Don't miss out on this chance to build the ultimate PC game collection for next to nothing. And use my links below to grab these deals before they disappear, or if you want to support my work in a more personal way, access my cosplay photo library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon. I will see you all in the next video.